Do you have anxiety, stress, or just want to improve your overall well-being? Well, stay tuned because I'm going to talk about a book that I recently read that I think can help you. So I recently just finished reading this book, The Power of Now. It has been recommended to me for years. I see it on so many lists of books that you should read if you're trying to just improve yourself, improve your mentality, improve your life. A bestseller. I think it sold like 5 million copies. It said on this one. It's probably more now since this is, I don't know what year this book was made, but I know it got popular from Oprah recommending it. The author, Eckhart, I don't know if it's Tolle or Tolle. He's very well known as like a sort of spiritual, I don't want to say guru, but like a teacher or thought leader. So in this video today, I'm going to talk about some of the main takeaways I had from the book, as well as some of my own personal thoughts and things I liked about it, or ways I, received the reading. Now, I am somebody who has dealt with anxiety, not as much as I used to, but anxiety, stress. I overthink things constantly, especially when it comes to my art and my business. I can very much get stuck in my own head, even with my relationships, with things around the house. Literally almost all areas of my life, I find myself kind of overthinking. And so I felt it'd be a good time to get into this one and learn to be more present and in the moment. So if you're someone like me that deals with a lot of stress or anxiety, or you just find yourself getting in a spiral of thoughts that just make yourself kind of go crazy, I would highly recommend giving this book a read. So the first kind of concept that it jumps into in the book is that your thoughts are not you. It's almost like, I've heard the term, like you have a roommate inside your head. The mind is a tool that we use. However, it can become such a powerful tool that the tool can end up using you. For example, if you're stressed out and having negative thoughts about the reasons that you are stressed, that's not necessarily you talking, it's your mind. It's not like your highest self, your true best self, if that makes sense. The thoughts that come from these like stress, pain points are coming from our ego, not our highest self. So that's kind of how he differentiates, like the stressful thoughts that we have are coming from our ego, not our highest self. And he instructs you on how to be in the now. And when you're in the now, you're thinking less from your ego self and more from your higher self. The first sort of tool that he recommends is gaining awareness of this thoughts. If you find yourself being stressed, recognize the thoughts that you're saying that to yourself, these stressed out kind of thoughts or worries, concerns, complaints, whatever. And just having awareness of that is the first sort of step in being able to separate your ego from your highest self. Now, honestly, I feel like this is a very simple concept to just separate your thoughts and label them as being your ego. However, I personally think it takes a lot of practice, and it's much easier to describe it in the book than to actually apply it to your life. And when I was reading the book, I noticed there would be times where I would have to reread the paragraph because I didn't quite fully understand it, because my mind was somewhere else. It was thinking about what time do I gotta wake up for work tomorrow, or what am I gonna wear, or I don't know, whatever. And it was a really interesting sort of I don't know what the word is, practice, I guess. Just in reading it was a sort of good first step in doing that. And like, even before I got to living my normal life and trying to apply this stuff, even just while reading it, I found myself able to start applying it, which was really interesting. I also think it's kind of funny because I'm going to be sharing my thoughts about this book while also talking about how our thoughts are not really us. So that's just like a whole weird contradiction in itself. And if I'm already starting to get you kind of like confused, or this seems sort of like all over the place, I guess, as far as like the concepts, I feel like it kind of is. The concepts in the book are simple. However, the author covers a whole bunch of different areas in which they can apply to you. And even though the concepts are rather simplistic, the execution and the reality of it, I feel like, is much more complex. I did really like that in the reading of the book, the author, he uses the sort of ego self he switches perspectives in the book. Like, he's talking as himself as the author that's trying to teach you. And then in italics, he will use the sort of ego voice that will have questions about what he's bringing up. And I thought that was a really smart way of addressing things, because I found myself asking certain questions sometimes. And so I thought that was just like a really good way of sort of covering all the bases and making it appeal to like the average reader rather than being sort of like talked down to. And then, so the next sort of like big concept of the book is that the past and the future don't exist, and all that exists is now in the present moment. And I feel like that's a very cliche thing that you hear, and I've said it myself before, that's like, you know, live in the moment, be present, seize the day, or whatever. And again, it's a simple concept, but the execution of it is, especially if you're somebody like who has struggled with anxiety, depression, stress, whatever, it is something that is kind of tricky to handle. So how do you be more in the present and not worry about the past or the future? Well, the author recommends to surrender to the now. And again, simple concept, kind of difficult in execution. Basically, he says that if you have a problem, your problem stems not from the situation, but rather your resistance towards it. So that was a really interesting concept. And as I was reading this, he addressed most of the questions, but tons of things popped up for me. And there were some points where I felt myself feeling kind of triggered and not offended, but like, I don't know, sort of like, I guess like feeling like it doesn't cover all the bases, if that makes sense, of like all the difficulties of life. And I will say though, that I think it's not the author's fault that I was feeling that way. It's a personal thing for myself of having to deal with my ego self. That was also kind of just like an eye-opener of like raising my awareness and conscientiousness of the content that he was talking about. I will also say too, I felt like this book was almost like it wasn't a hard read for me, but it also wasn't like an easy or sort of like light read. I almost got this sort of feeling like it was a textbook that I should sort of study. And honestly, I will probably read this again in the future, because I had some like sort of resistance and stuff coming up with the initial read. I feel like I need to just like absorb that, like let it sink in, try to practice some of it, and then return to it again after I've like implemented some more of like the suggestions that he puts in the book. One of the things I really liked about this book and thought was very impressive was that the author, he mentions being a woman versus being a man is sort of different to practice some of these things. I don't know if he mentioned minorities, but he did mention being like not heterosexual, but I feel like some of this could also apply to like minorities. So he covers like all these different, because if you're different, like depending on what your demographic, your age, your race, your gender, all that stuff, you know, everyone has sort of different levels of how they're perceiving the world, etc. And he does a good job of explaining how these concepts are sort of like applicable depending on your situation, or addressing like the sort of challenges that different people may face depending on your circumstances. And he also addresses things such as like emotional pain versus physical pain, being someone who's in prison, being someone who may have a disability, aging. He also covers points such as addiction and even the patriarchy. And he also covers things such as friendships or relationships and romantic relationships, even toxic relationships. I thought that was very smart because it left very little room for me to have further questions on things. Like, he really did do a good job of covering everything. And I also like that the way that he speaks in the book, it's very much, even though it's written by a white man, it doesn't have like a mansplaining vibe to it or like a privilegey type vibe, which I think that's kind of hard to do for a lot of male authors, and he did a very good job of that. Which, again, I think that was just really smart and thorough of him to do. Some of the concepts in the book that he mentions, I was already sort of familiar with the manifestation and just like inner self work that I've been doing over the past couple years. There was definitely some new points and new considerations to take from it. I would recommend this book. However, I would say that if you're looking for a fun read, this is not necessarily the one. If you're looking for like a fun spiritual read, this is not. It wasn't necessarily fun to read, and it did feel kind of like work. However, I am glad I did it because I do feel like smarter for it. And as I mentioned, there were points where I would have to reread a paragraph just because I wasn't fully absorbing the information, or I found it kind of easy to, I know this sounds bad, but I found it kind of easy to like space out in some of it. And again, I wouldn't say that's necessarily on the author. That was the sort of trigger for me, like, hey, your ego mind needs to like be aware of like the present and the now instead of like having your thoughts be elsewhere. So I thought that whole thing was like a trip for me too. And even like I said, even if you're not able to, even if you're not getting to the point yet in your life where you can practice the stuff in the book, even just reading the book itself is a good practice of being in the now. All right, so that's my short little review and thoughts on The Power of Now. If you've ever read this book before, I'm curious what your main takeaways were from it, or anything that really like struck you, what you liked about it. If there's any sort of practices you learned from it that you utilize on the daily. And if you like this video, like, comment, share, subscribe, all that great stuff. And I'll catch you on the next video. Bye.